What's up everyone, welcome back to ARTV. My name is John and it's time for a review of the fourth studio album by the alternative band and the indie folkers from the UK, Mumford and Sons. Their new record is titled Delta. In the past, I haven't exactly been super crazy about Mumford, although I did enjoy their last album, Wilder Mind. I just often found them to be a little bit forced, a little bit contrived in some ways. But I think at their best, they had a lot of anthemic tunes that maybe made you feel good, but at their worst, they were just kind of mind-numbingly boring, and that's kind of the worst offense that music can commit. Now, today, it's not just going to be myself reviewing this album. I've invited my friend Spectrum Pulse to discuss this new record, Delta, with me, and I will leave his channel linked down below. I highly recommend subscribing, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. And now that Spectrum Pulse has joined the chat, we can officially start talking about Delta by Mumford and Sons. Mark, what's your relationship with Mumford been like over time?
Honestly, it's been hit and miss. I will say I liked Sigh No More and Babel halfway decently. I would never call them great albums, but they had their bangers, they had their momentum behind them. They lost me hard in Wilder Mind, I'll freely admit that.
Wilder Mind was an interesting record for me because at the time when it came out, I felt like I was really connecting with it just because of some of the themes that were brought up, but I suppose as I discovered other bands that were doing similar things but in much better ways, I kind of agree with what you said about souring on it. There's still great songs on there like Tompkins Square Park that I personally love. And while I know a lot of people hated the single Believe from that album, I was never of that mindset. I don't think it's great, but still, it's okay. And on this new album, Delta, it seems like they've kind of gone maybe back a little bit in the sense that they're not as scared to pick up a banjo again. But a lot of other things have truly gone downhill and just get downright boring.
So yeah, going into this project, you weren't wrong saying they had brought some of the banjo back, but going into a few interviews that I had read with Marcus Mumford, it said that they were actually taking a lot of steps to synthesize more of those arrangements and instrumentation. They had taken the banjo and then they process it to hell and back under a lot of the production work, the solitary producer Paul Epworth, and you can really tell. If anything, this is more of a defined shift away from an electric, scuzzier sound into something that's a lot more heavily arranged and atmospheric, damn near post-rock at points. And it doesn't work for me whatsoever. I'll just say that right out of the gate. I think it's very clumsy. I think there's very little groove. There's so little momentum. This album drags like a motherfucker, and it's just a pain in the ass to really just get through so many of these tunes, especially when the tunes are so desaturated and colorless.
Yeah, I think that Paul Epworth here, throwing him in as the producer, that's something that honestly could get me excited because I'm a huge Florence and the Machine fan. But seeing his talents there versus seeing them being 95% of the time not really utilized much at all, this feels like a sanitized project that could have really been done by anybody, including the band themselves. There were a few tracks that they said they gave to Paul as some sort of test. I think one of those was Slip Away. I think that was the song that they gave to him as the test track to see if he could handle producing for Mumford and Sons. And I just don't know what it is, the special connection that they found with Paul in terms of production or helping maybe assist in some of these songs in any way, because as you said, it's a complete chore to listen to this album. It's 14 tracks, it's over an hour, and it does absolutely nothing to justify that. There are very few tracks that have any sort of real spirit or connection to them. It feels like you're being weighed down the entire time and not necessarily outright preached to, but occasionally it does feel that way with the themes of religion and just the way that Marcus Mumford feels like he hasn't ever been in a relationship before sometimes. You hate to say it, but the way that he describes things and the way that he talks about women, it just seems like he's writing from this outdated point of view where he doesn't exactly have a firm grasp on any kind of reality.
We'll come back to that at length, but I think the thing that really struck me when we going back to some of the sound and how heavy it can feel and how slow it can feel, what it almost reminded me of is The National. Because you get with that very clear tone and presence. But the difference there is that Aaron Dessner and Bryce Dessner, they have always had a commitment to the low-end groove, so there's pulsating momentum. And say what you will about Matt Berninger for the drunken souse that he is, but he sells it. You can tell that even his guttural baritone, he at least cares about this. What really bothered me a lot on this album is how detached Marcus Mumford seemed to sound. He was trying to sell a lot of these songs with a lot of his vocals as being more restrained, more muted, more tasteful, dare I even say. But it's absolutely the wrong framing for when it comes to songs with this particular subject matter.
Sure. I think a prime example of what you're kind of talking about there would be a track like The Wild. That's one where you really see him trying to be maybe a little bit more atmospheric, a little bit more serious with his tone. But the way that it comes across, and I saw their interview with Consequence of Sound where they went track by track and talked about every single song on the album. This is apparently one that Marcus worked on and tried to play all of these different instruments on. He worked on it by himself. And then you think, okay, that could be cool when it's translated to the record. And it just kind of is a summation of all of the problems that I'm seeing with the overall sound and the fact that it feels lackluster, it burns itself out, and it never really goes anywhere. What worked and what didn't work on this album, it can kind of obviously be an outbalanced scale there, with the positives being down lower and the negatives being up high. But I do want to put it out there and say that there were some things that I did enjoy on the record. I did not totally hate this, nor do I find it to always be just completely abysmal. 42 is a song that I thought was pretty good, and fun fact, that actually is their 42nd song, apparently, that they've officially released, so that's why that one is titled 42. And it does have a vibrant second half, but again, I still feel that formula tweaking in the background. It's like, it finally breaks out. And I do hear that in the track Forever, where you kind of feel like they got a little bit of their roots back, where they had those soaring hooks that felt like, you could get a crowd of people singing along, and obviously Marcus Mumford letting loose. The buzzing guitar on Rose of Sharon I found pretty enjoyable, even if I didn't really care for the overall vibe of that song and the lyrics. And going into Picture You in Darkness Visible, say what you will, and I know we will, about what that song compromises. Darkness Visible, of course, being a reference to Paradise Lost, the 1600s poetry by John Milton. I do like how those two tracks connected. I liked that there was some sort of vision behind that. And I felt the second half of Darkness Visible in particular. I like the fact that they threw some banjos in the mix and everything just actually felt like it had a groove. And that's what a lot of the record was missing, that groove that you've already talked about.
Yep. And you know what? I'll actually highlight one song that actually kind of did work for me. October Skies. I liked the more restrained, almost melancholy, almost ethereal vibe that came through there. And the one thing that I will call out Marcus Mumford for, there was some decent poetry there. It was a little bit more abstract and longing. It put you in the mind of walking in a misty autumn forest. It connected a little bit more there. The problem is, it's one of the few examples on the album where the poetry is anything close to good. And this is where I'm going to actually have to contradict you here with regards to the inclusion of that Paradise Lost case. I don't think that works at all. And it draws specifically because of a juxtaposition. If you have a guy from Old Crow Medicine Show come and recite classical poetry on your album, and your own writing can't hold a candle to either Old Crow Medicine Show or John Milton, you've got a problem. I hate how Marcus Mumford writes about women. Plain and simple. As you already said, it feels outdated, but more to the point, it gets really creepy and at points borderline rapey. Let's go actually, I've got some notes here. I had to get some of these lyrics printed off. The worst song for me on the album was Wild Heart.
Oh, yeah.
Because we get the line,
was a...
we won't both get our way. If we do, it won't be tonight anyway. So I hold you by the jaw and kiss you to be sure. The entire song is about taming this wild woman who can put him down. And yet, it's really creepy how clingy, how that specifically feels. And go a step further to that, you go over to, it was Slip Away. It's got lines like, but you're not yourself. I know you better than you. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Mumford and Sons got a tremendous amount of backlash when they were seen with the whole pictures with Jordan Peterson. And I'm not going to touch Jordan Peterson. Fantano's done a great job talking about it. ContraPoints has done a good job talking about that as well. My point surrounding this, I was not surprised whatsoever when I saw the two of them together. And I won't even come across as, in terms of judging the politics of the album and the very odd conservative bent that runs through some of these lyrics, I wouldn't, I'm not going to judge that in terms of the intent. If that's their belief, that's fine. And they clearly have an audience for it. The problem is, they don't seem to frame it with any sort of self-deprecating nuance.
Breaking down a few of the remaining tracks that we have here from this album's 14 that it has to offer, I did want to agree with you, Mark, on October Skies. That was a moment that did stand out to me, but I will admit that it didn't jump out until I just happened to be outside, listening to this album. And obviously we're in the season of autumn and fall right now. So I guess I started hearing a little bit more of that crispness that you were talking about, how you could just kind of feel like you were in that chilling environment almost. So I feel like October Skies is one of the few songs that did that kind of brooding, tense, fall or else seasonal aspect, and they did it justice. I also did enjoy the closing moment, at least in places. I still have issues with the song, but the closing moment to this album, the title track, Delta. Did you have any strong thoughts or feelings on that one? Because I thought that it started off so ridiculously bland, and then it actually moved into something where I felt like, at least if I could give this album anything, the drums actually stood out to me just a little bit here. Mm-hmm. The guitars, I thought that it was probably one of the best things that this album has to offer. But again, how much is that saying at the end of the day, I guess? But I really did like the chord progression on this one, and actually throwing a few other things in the mix, like the banjo once again. Even though it did feel a bit more processed, I still thought it was not bad.
To me, it feels a little overprocessed as a whole, and I'll freely admit that once you get to the end of the album, it's part of you that's just so exhausted with the lack of momentum that this thing has that you just want to just coast it out to the very end. And I won't say it's a particularly strong conclusion in that regard, especially when you get into the lyrics and you start considering larger themes, because for as much as Delta was, as much as Marcus Mumford has described this album as, this is a point where they're dealing with death, depression, divorce, a couple of those big D's and those heavier subjects, and the Delta is the path going forward, where to go from there. And I get the point of leaving the question almost kind of unanswered, but the truth be told is that I'm not sure this album even really presents much of the question. It feels like a Mumford & Sons album, but it feels kind of lacking that deeper core to really make Delta connect as strongly as I'd like it to. It's pretty, it's not bad, but it doesn't really stand out to me either. Overall, I'm left without a lot to really say about this. I won't say that I'm disappointed, because I didn't have high expectations coming off of Wilder Mind, and Guiding Light as a single didn't really inspire much, and I didn't really get a lot. I'm coming back with Mumford and Sons, and I'm just having to put this band into a box, what I call the silent majority box. As in, critics will never like this, but they're going to have their audience regardless. And as much as I could have words about said audience, at the end of the day, the problem is that the music's not all that inspired.
Yeah, it's definitely tame, and even the songs that I like best here, I didn't mind Guiding Light at all. It was fine for what it was. Couldn't stand the second single, If I Say, which was completely repetitive and pointless. It just reeked of uninspired, and the way that he said certain things. If I say I love you, then I love you. It was just something that kind of showed me what was to come. If this was Marcus being honest and introspective and looking inward, then what were we gonna get of real merit or substance here? I'm gonna go with a very light 2.5 out of 5. And of course, on your scale, that's a 5 out of 10. What are you thinking, Mark?
I'm thinking a light 4 out of 10, which is a 2 out of 5. I think it was a chore to get through. The production feels completely lost. Paul Epworth was wasted as a producer. There weren't nearly the same sort of soaring moments that Mumford and Sons have delivered in the past. And forget the politics of all of this. Even if they were trying to execute upon those ideas, it comes across as flat, lifeless, and dull. This album was such a chore to get through. And honestly, if you like this, I mean, good for you, but even you have to realize that Mumford & Sons has done a lot better, a lot more often. I'm comfortable calling this their worst album.
That concludes our review of Delta today. Mark, thank you so much for joining me. Why don't you tell the people a little bit about what you do?
Sure. I'm the host of Spectrum Pulse. I talk about music, movies, art, and culture. I got my weekly series, Billboard Breakdown, where I go into the madness and unfortunate nature of the current Billboard Hot 100. It's not a good year. I also have my series Resonators, where I go back in time and talk about albums from the past. This year it's been focused on 80s hardcore punk, and I've got a special finale episode coming up in December, which I'm really excited about. And going forward from there, we're both heading into year-end list, and while I don't do a worst albums list, I'm not going to spoil anything for you, John, but...
well, just don't be surprised, guys. That's all I'm going to say. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure you subscribe to his channel. It is linked, hopefully, here on screen in the outro, or else in the description down below. All of my socials are down there as well, and you can now pick up ARTV merch. I've got the merch shelf linked, and those links should all be right below you. I'll see you right here on ARTV for more.